Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sunday School Review. This week's Sunday School lesson is entitled Worship is Restored and is taken from Ezra, the third chapter, verses 1 through 6 and verses 10 through 13. Now, this book, that is Ezra, it's attributed to Ezra. Now, Ezra was a priest and a scribe, and he was an influential leader. And Ezra was a direct descendant of the very first high priest, that is Aaron. Ezra is a direct descendant of Aaron. As I said, Aaron was a priest, scribe, and a leader. Now, Ezra was an individual who was responsible for the second wave of exiles that returned to Jerusalem after the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. The first wave was led by Zerubbabel. So Ezra was involved in the second wave of exiles that returned to Jerusalem to rebuild. And it's in the first chapter of Ezra, it mentions verse 1. Now, the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, Persia overthrew Babylon. So Cyrus, who was a pagan king, and Cyrus was mentioned in scriptures before, and verse 1 of Ezra, Cyrus was the king, and as I said, Persia overthrew Babylon, and Cyrus, that is the king of Persia, made a decree. This is in verse 1 of Ezra, made a proclamation throughout all the kingdom and put it in writing, saying, Thus said Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord Jehovah, God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and had charged me to build an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So when Cyrus became king, well, Cyrus was a king of Persia, as I said, Persia overthrew Babylon. So Cyrus made a decree to allow the Jews to return to their homeland. Now, it was promised that the Jews would return. It was already prophesied that the Jews would return. As I said, after 70 years of captivity, they would return and be allowed to rebuild in Jerusalem. Now, Babylon, years before, had destroyed Jerusalem and also had destroyed the temple there at Jerusalem. That is Solomon's temple. And this, what we're going to be talking about today, is the second temple at Jerusalem, not the first temple. And the lesson is going to explain a little bit where it's going to talk about the beauty of the first temple, that is Solomon's temple, and how it compares with the second temple. Okay, so after the first temple was destroyed and lie in ruins, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, has allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild. Okay, and as I said, Ezra, Zerubbabel was the first one of the first waves, but Ezra being one of the second waves, and we're going to talk about Ezra's mission or role, and that's what the lesson is about. Worship is restored. Now let's look at our lesson. There are two outlines. The first outline is rebuilding the altar. That is verses 1 through 6 of Ezra 3. The second outline is, I said, the first outline, rebuilding the altar, and the second outline is laying the foundation. That is Ezra 10 through 13, laying the foundation. Okay, let's go back to our first outline, that is rebuilding the altar. And we're going to begin in verse 1. It says, the people gather, and when the 7th month was come, and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. So the first, in this first verse, it tells you the people were one, they were united. Now, our lesson starts at chapter 3, but if we look at, we read a couple of verses from, we pointed out a couple of things from Ezra 1, 2, 1 and 2. And now we go to Ezra chapter 2, verses 6 to 4 and 6 to 5. This is Ezra 2, 6 to 4 and 6 to 5. And the whole congregation together was 40 and 2,303 scores, about 50,000 people. Okay, so that's just before chapter 3. So when the people gathered, we talking about 50,000 people. Okay, verse 6 to 5. Besides their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337, there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. So when we're talking about in chapter 3, the people gathered, we're talking about roughly 50,000 people. Okay, and they were one. They were united. There was unity there. Okay, so verse 2a actually. Then stood up Jeshu, the son of Josadak, and his brethren, and the priest Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren, and build the altar of God, of the God of Israel. Now, and this is the name of the outline, rebuilding the altar. Now, and the second outline is laying the foundation. Okay, so we see a particular order here. And the first order of business, as our lesson lays it out, is rebuilding the altar. So as people say, do first things first. So let's rebuild the altar, because the altar has a very significant purpose. Okay, the altar serves to offer sacrifices to God. And remember last week's lesson where when Solomon was dedicating the first temple, Solomon's temple, the first temple, and when the scripture said, when he had finished his prayer, so Solomon offered a prayer of dedication. And when he offered the prayer, the fire came down and burned up the burnt offering, the sacrifice. And it said that the glory of the Lord filled the temple, that the priest couldn't go in and minister. So that represented the presence of God. So offering sacrifices on the altar represents your true worship to God. So the first thing first, before we talk about rebuilding the structure, let's get our spiritual life in order. And this is why they rebuild the altar first, before even beginning to lay the foundation. So that's the importance of this rebuilding the altar first, is to establish a relationship with God. That's what you want to do. Restore worship. Okay. Get right with God. That's more important. Getting right with God was more important than actually building or rebuilding the temple. That was more important. As I said, do first things first. Do the important things first. And that's the spiritual condition of the people's heart was important. That's what took priority. Rebuilding the altar was more important. So that's why the focus was first on rebuilding the altar so sacrifices could be made, so God's presence would be in the building, in the place, in the among that presence. And that was Solomon's prayer in the rededication we talked about last week, where when Solomon prayed, he was praying for mercy, he was praying for forgiveness, he was praying for guidance, and he was praying that when the people prayed in that place, that God would hear them. That was when they in the dedication. That's what he prayed for, and at that time, when we think back on last week's lesson, after he finished praying, after he had finished praying, as a matter of fact, the very first verse in last week's lesson said, "Now when Solomon had made it into praying, the fire came down." And that represented the presence of God. So, and that was, and so the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. So the sacrifices was meant to establish relationship, to usher in God's presence, and that was more important than actually laying the foundation. And that's why that was first. Okay. Let's go. I think we at verse 2, we read verse 2a. Now let's read verse 2b of Ezra now, the third chapter. It said the burnt offering, to offer burnt offering thereon, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. So basically, what they're saying is, okay, let's go back and get this right. Let's get this right. Let's build an altar so we can offer sacrifices to God, to burn offering, as is written in the law of Moses. Let's follow this to the letter. We're not going to deviate from this. Let's follow this to the letter. And verse 3 says, and they set the altar upon his bases, for fear was upon them because the people of those countries. Now, in other words, what is it saying right here in verse 3a says, because now they had came back to Judah after the 7 years of captivity. There were enemies in the land. There were people all around him. The land wasn't, I mean, the land was laid waste, but that area was not vacant of people. There were enemies there. And they offered burnt offering there upon the Lord, even burnt offering morning and evening. So basically, even though they were in the presence of their enemies was all around them, attacking them, and all sorts of things of that nature, they offered these offerings. It says, for fear was upon them. So in other words, they were afraid. But we're not going to let that stop us from sacrificing to God. Okay, that's basically what they were saying. We're not going to let that stop us from offering burnt offering thereupon unto the Lord, even burnt offering morning and evening. So they did it morning and evening. They continued to do it, even though they were afraid for being attacked. They still did this. Okay, in verse 4, they kept also the Feast of the Tabernacles, which was a 7-day feast, as it was written. That was one of now the Feast of the Tabernacles was, as I said, was 7-day feast, but the Feast of the Tabernacles, they lived in tents. Now this was to remember the protection in the wilderness. God, and how God had protected them while they were wandering in the wilderness. So this Feast of the Tabernacles, like I said, they lived in tabernacles. They lived in tents during this period of time, okay, to commemorate the fact that God had protected, that is their ancestors, okay, from through their wandering in the wilderness. Okay, so this is what the Feast of the Tabernacles, it was to commemorate, okay, their past protection, how God protected them. Remember we talked about how, not we didn't talk about it, but you remember how they was in the wilderness 40 years, and they, as they say, they clothes didn't wear out, and I guess clothes didn't get too little, whatever. But God protected them through that a 40-year wandering experience in the wilderness. And that's what the Feast of the Tabernacles represented. It says, as it is written, and offer daily burnt offering by number according to the custom as the duty of every day required. In other words, they did it by the numbers. They didn't shortchange it. They did it exactly as it was written in the law of Moses and the law of Moses. That they did it exactly like that. Okay, so basically, what this first outline is talking about rebuilding the altar. That is to restoring worship. That's tantamount to restoring worship, and we want to want your heart, get the people's heart right with God first before we talking about building the structure. It doesn't matter if you got a magnificent structure, but your heart is not right. That's no good. You want to get your heart right. Magnificent structure is fine, but if your heart is not right, it's all for nothing. Okay, that's what the rebuilding symbolizes. Rebuilding of the altar symbolizing getting right with God, getting your heart right. Forget about the structure. We can focus on the structure later, but we want to get your heart right. You want your heart to be right with God first. That's the first order of business. And that's why the rebuilding of the altar came first, is to restore worship, okay? Establish a true relationship with God. And as again, as I said, when Solomon made his prayer, that he prayed for guidance. So you want guidance when you're rebuilding the temple. I mean, so you want the guidance of the Lord throughout that process. So you want to do that first. Your spiritual condition is very important. Is more important than physically rebuilding the temple itself. Okay, so that was the first outline. Now, well, actually, we got two more verses still in the first outline, which is verse 5 and 6. Okay, let's read those. And afterwards, offering the continual burnt offering, both of the new moons and all of the set feasts of the Lord that were consecrated, and of everyone that willingly offered a free will offering to the Lord. This is talking about, as I said, they did it according to the law of Moses. They did it as per the law of Moses. Okay, and verse 6, on the first day of the seventh month began they to offer burnt offering unto the Lord. Okay, 6b said, but the foundation of the temple was not yet laid. Again, as I said, the first order of business was to rebuild the altar to offer sacrifices to God, getting right with God first. And verse 6b said, the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. So before they began to lay the foundation, they wanted to get the people's heart right with God. Okay. Now, the second outline is the laying of the foundation. 6b just tells you the foundation was not laid. The altar was built. They began to offer sacrifices to the Lord for God's presence. Now we get to verse 10 and the second outline, which is laying a foundation. Now let's go to verse 10. It's 10 through 13, but let's read verse 10 first. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests and their apparel and trumpet, and the Levites, the son of Asaph, was assembled to praise the Lord after the ordinance of David, king of Israel. Now, and we talked about that last week, how David introduced the instruments, the musical instruments. So David was responsible for music in worship. That's what it's talking about there in verse 10. The music and worship. They set the priests and they appear with trumpets and all of that. So it's talking about music and worship. And David was the one that introduced that. Okay, let's go to verse 11. And they sang together by chorus and praising and giving thanks unto the Lord because he's good. Okay, for his mercy endures forever toward Israel. Okay, this is what they sang. Okay, 11b, and all the people shouted with a great shout, and when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house was laid. Okay, that's when they shouted, because we have the laying of the foundation. Now, this again, let me be clear here. This is the second temple in Jerusalem. We're gonna explore this when we get to the last two verses here. That is 12 and 13. Remember, the second temple in Jerusalem, okay, built by Zerubbabel. Now, the first temple we talked about last week, the first temple was Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple. This is not Solomon's temple. Now, it's built on the same site. And we're going to see in these last two verses why it's not Solomon's temple. It's not Solomon's temple. It's the second temple in Jerusalem. Now, let's read verse 12. And we're going to see the mixed emotion. Verse 12 says, but many of the priests and Levites are the fathers. Let's listen. Let's read it again. But many of the priests and Levites and chiefs of the father who were ancient men and that had seen the first house, that is Solomon's temple. So the older priests and Levites and chiefs of the father who were ancient men, basically who were older men. Okay, remember they was in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. So obviously it was much older than 70 years, okay? So otherwise they wouldn't have seen the first house. So many of them had seen the first house, that is Solomon's temple, when the foundation of this house, this is the second temple, when the foundation of this house, that is the second temple, was laid before their eyes, when they saw it, those that had seen the land of the foundation of the first temple, when they seen the foundation of the second temple, said of this house, were laid before their eyes, wept. They wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy. Okay, what are you saying here? Those that were older and that had seen Solomon's temple, when they saw the second temple in comparison to the splendor. Now, the second temple was no doubt magnificent. I said the second temple was no doubt magnificent. But when these elderly people saw in comparison they wept. They said, this is not Solomon's temple. It's nothing like Solomon's temple. Those that hadn't, oh, they was with joy. Man, this is a magnificent building. Yes, it was. I'm sure. I wasn't there, but yes, it was. But in comparison to the first temple, that is Solomon's temple, it didn't have the splendor, didn't have the beauty of that. It says, let's look at the latter part of verse 12 again. When the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy. Okay, those that had never seen the first temple, oh, they was happy. And let's go to 13, which is our last verse. So that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy. In other words, it was so, I mean, the noise was so great, it was indistinguishable. You couldn't distinguish, well, yeah, these are the ones shouting for joy, these are the ones weeping. But it says, verse 13 says, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. So those that were weeping were the ones that saw the first temple. And so this is, and they were weeping. The ones that were shouting for joy were the one had not seen the first temple. They only saw the second temple in Jerusalem. Remember again, I said the first temple was destroyed. Babylon came in and destroyed Jerusalem, tore the temple down. So that's why you had to rebuild the temple. And this is the second temple, not the original Solomon's temple, but the second temple at Jerusalem. Okay, it said, for the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar. Okay, so the last two verses gives us the mixed emotion, okay, of the people. Some shouted for joy, those that had not seen the first temple in its magnificence, versus the weeping, that is those that the scripture said was ancient, the older people that had seen the splendor of the first temple, that is Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. But nevertheless, the key point of the lesson really is worship is restored. And the order in which they went about first restoring order, getting your heart, and that's the important takeaway, is your heart, getting your heart right with God. What use is worship in a magnificent structure when your heart is not right? You're not in the right relationship with God. So that's really, I think, the takeaways from this lesson is establish relationship with God first. And because having God's presence gives you guidance, gives you and as I said, what Solomon prayed for, he prayed for mercy, forgiveness, guidance, and they were here. So that in construction, in constructing the temple and rebuilding the temple, they needed guidance, and you always need God's guidance. So welcoming God's presence is very important to the mission. And that's our lesson today. Worship is restored. And worship was restored when the altar was rebuilt, and they began to offer sacrifices to God as required, as prescribed in the law of Moses. We'd like to thank you for watching. We ask you to join us next week for another edition of the Sunday School Review. Thank you.